team is very excited to have you here, and especially to have Dr. Jude Nicholas with us from Norway. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about Jude. He is a certified clinical neuropsychologist and a researcher employed at Statped Vest Center for Deaf Blindness at Haukeland University Hospital in Bergen, Norway. He has over 25 years of clinical and research experience working with children and adults with sensory loss, a long-standing interest in toxic conditions, genetic syndromes, and neurological conditions that involve sensory impairments and cognitive functions. He is the author of several articles and book chapters on these topics. Outside of his career, Jude loves to spend time reading, traveling with family, and channel zapping. His current research investigates the psychological functions of tactile conditions and the pragmatic understanding of how the tactile system functions, particularly in persons with deaf blindness. So we're very excited. This topic for our students is so important, as many of our students use their foreground tactile sense for information gathering and to interpret the world around them, to communicate with others, and to participate in many ways. So welcome, Jude. We're looking forward to listening this morning.
Thank you to the POPDB team for the invitation, and especially for Lynn for your introduction. So I'm really excited to do this presentation. As mentioned, I will be talking on the topic of tactile working memory and strategies to support tactile communication. And we know let me introduce tactile working memory, and then I will talk about the pragmatic understanding, and eventually the most important part of how we could implement strategies to promote tactile working memory. So tactile working memory in many ways involves the bodily tactile system, including the sense of touch. Through the bodily tactile modality, people with deaf blindness could learn, communicate, and connect to the world. And the importance of the sense of touch is recognized, and bodily tactile strategies have been implemented in the approach for people with deaf blindness. However, recently, many of us who are seeing and hearing individuals have come to realize the importance of sense of touch after we have started to receive less of them due to the ongoing pandemic. In many ways, we are becoming a touch-starved society as we communicate more digitally rather than through tactile interaction of touching each other in person. So before we understand the concept of tactile working memory, we need to ask what is working memory? Working memory is defined and allows us to hold information in mind without losing track of what we are doing. Think of it as the brain's own sticky notes, essentially memory that is being worked out in the moment. Thus, the meaning working memory. The main body of my talk would address the following topics. First, I will talk about the sense of touch and the processing of information through the topics of sensory processing and information processing. I will then talk about how to understand working memory through the bodily tactile system in regards to bodily tactile sensations, perception, and cognition. And finally, I will give an understanding of how working memory is assessed and identified in the bodily tactile modality using the tactile working memory scale. And here I would also talk more about the effective learning strategies to promote tactile working memory. To highlight the importance of the sense of touch for people with deafblindness, I refer to a quote given by my colleague in Sweden, Linda Eriksson, who is a person living with deafblindness. She said, quote, "Although people with deafblindness may vary in their use of their residual senses and differ in the approach to communication, the sense of touch is so crucial for all people with deafblindness." Furthermore, we should view deafblindness as a positive state in which active touch, bodily movements, posture, gestures are the preeminent source of information, and not as a negative state of being in which sight and hearing are no longer present. So to focus on the sense of touch and what is present is one of the major topic of my talk today. There are many names for our sense of touch. They might be referred as the haptic sense, tactile sense, somatosensory sense, or the bodily tactile sense. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, as they say. In this lecture, the concept of tactile, somatosensory, and bodily tactile sense would be used interchangeably. So one of the main assumptions when relating to sensory processing in deafblindness is when hearing and vision are lost simultaneously, there's a high risk that the processing of information will be fragmented or limited. And many interventions compensate for the limitations in hearing and vision, and subsequently providing an environment that allows to make the best use of the bodily tactile modality. We could understand sensory processing in two ways. One is referred as the unisensory information processing, and this relates to the single senses or the sensory systems which operate independently. While multisensory information processing refers to the sensory system or the different senses interacting with each other. The two types of sensory information is illustrated here, and it shows that how sensory information is initially processed as independent or segregated processing, and further on they converge and are integrated or transferred further. So this is the two ways which sensory information is processed, through unisensory or multisensory processing. So let's go a bit further to understand how multisensory processing occurs. The two types of multisensory will involve a multisensory integration and multisensory transfer. In multisensory information, it is the merging of information from different sensory modalities. This happens in a synchronous manner or has a simultaneous occurrence. For instance, when bouncing a basketball, you would see or you would feel that there is an up-down motion visually. There would be a silence and sound alternation, an auditory input, and a touch, no touch alternation, which is the bodily sensations. So in this example, all three of the sensory information from the three senses are integrated in a synchronous manner. On the other hand, multi-sensory transfer, it's a transfer of information between sensory modalities. They occur in a non-synchronous manner or has a sequential occurrence. In this sense, if you see a bird and then later on, just a few seconds later, the bird chirps, but our brain will process this information as multisensory. However, the sensory information is transferred from one sensus to the other. And this could also occur for all the sensory inputs. So it could be from tactile to visual or from visual to tactile. So in this way, multisensory processing occurs in a sequential manner. In neuroscience, the synchronous manner or multisensory integration is referred as parallel processing, while multisensory transfer is referred as serial processing. Importantly, the bodily tactile sense gives us the opportunity to learn about objects through unisensory or multisensory processing using physical interaction. Furthermore, neuroscientific studies have given evidence of distinct brain regions or networks supporting unisensory and multisensory processing. Let us look now at how information is processed beyond sensory processing by applying the information processing approach. According to this model, an individual's sensory, perceptual, and cognitive processes are explained by a model where information flows through and is perceived, processed, and interpreted in one or more processing units. And these are placed under the concepts of sensory, perception, and cognition. When applying this model to the bodily tactile modality, we could see that information processing starts by actively seeking and focusing on the bodily tactile information from the surrounding environment. The flow of information starts on a sensory level from the sensation part in this model and moves forward towards the perceptual and cognitive processing units. And in this case, the perception units and the cognitive units will be the sensory register, the short-term memory, the working memory, the long-term memory, and the executive control unit. So particularly the working memory or the tactile working memory in this model has a critical function since it links the sensory perceptual processes, attention, and memory together with the executive control units, thus making it a central unit in this processing system. In this model, in addition to the sensation, perceptual, and cognitive information processing units, we could also see that information is processed as a sensory-driven process. That is what is referred as the bottom-up processing. And we have higher level attentional aspects that influence bodily tactile information processing and is referred as the top-down processing element. Furthermore, these different bodily tactile units are supported by distinct brain regions and are highly interconnected with several overlapping networks. For instance, tactile working memory is associated with the hippocampus region of the brain, which is the region of the brain responsible for memory and navigation skills. While working memory or tactile working memory is associated with the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is related to the higher order executive functions. All this suggests that the information processing of the bodily tactile information is a rich and a complex system and is equally a good system compared to the visual and auditory system. Now I've given you a short presentation of how the system in principle functions and how different areas of the brain are involved in this processing. One of the important questions we need to ask is whether this system has the ability to change its functions when the system is damaged or regarding sensory deprivation, or in the case of training. So this is what we call it as neuroplasticity or brain plasticity. That is the brain has the ability to change its structure and function regarding sensory deprivation or by intensive training. We could change, or is it possible to change the ability of the tactile processing system? I'll give some evidence regarding the neuroplasticity of the system. First of all, a neuroimaging study has shown that tactile learning and tactile training, in this case, tactile discrimination and braille reading, has shown to modify the plasticity in the somatosensory brain, that is the tactile brain, of normal subjects. In this case, it means that intensive training will lead to changes in brain functions. The second study is more of a developmental study on infant brain responses, and this study showed different brain activation patterns during felt touch and observed touch. I would like to explain this experiment in detail. So as it's seen here, during felt touch, that is when a child, this is an infant, and infants, they were around 5 months old, they were being touched on their hands, as in the A group or in the A part. And in the B part, they observe another adult, in this case, being touched on their hands. So the first is called the felt touch. They are being touched in their hands. On the second, they observe another person being touched. And when we look at the brain activation of this experiment, we see that during felt touch, the somatosensory brain areas, that is the tactile brain areas, were activated as expected. Touch leads to an activation in the tactile brain. While during observed touch, not only the visual areas of the brain were activated, but also the tactile brain areas were activated. And that this means that when a child or an infant looks at another person being touched, it's not just their visual system is activated, but their tactile brain system is also activated. And this leads to the assumption that infants as young as 5 months old can have an awareness of the connection between bodily self and others early in development, and this may lay the ground for imitating and empathizing with others. So again, showing how important the element of touch is related to infant imitation and the development of empathy. Regarding deaf blindness and neuroplasticity, there are many studies which have been done on the acquired deafblind or people with acquired deaf blindness. But this is a study done with children with a combined vision and hearing loss. This is an electrophysiological study, and this found significant functional changes in the somatosensory brain areas of children with vision and hearing loss in comparison to a control group of seeing and hearing children. And this study gives evidence of neuroplasticity in children with vision and hearing loss and suggests that in the simultaneous loss of hearing and vision at a very early stages of the neural development, the bodily tactile modality acquires a more important role in these children's contact with their surroundings. So again, suggesting neuroplasticity in the tactile brain due to visual and hearing impairment or loss. Many of the studies suggest that the tactile brain or the bodily tactile system is a robust and a resilient system. The next topic is about understanding working memory through the bodily tactile system. The bodily tactile system, as has been mentioned earlier, is a complex and an adaptive system, and they have the different aspects of the bodily tactile system are the bodily tactile sensations, the perception, and the cognition. So let's start with the bodily tactile sensations. The bodily tactile sensations it's a system which is different from the other sensory systems. For instance, when it comes to vision, it is located in one organ, in this sense, the eye. And when it comes to hearing, it's located in one organ, and that's the ear. But the bodily tactile sensations, they are distributed all over the body. So the organization of these systems or the bodily tactile sensations are different compared to the visual and auditory sensations. The bodily tactile sensations are formed by multiple sensations received from the surface or inside the body. And the different types of sensations, they will include light touch, which is the what we could refer as gentle touch. We have vibration and proprioception, which is the sense of understanding our bodily parts in space. It also includes pain, temperature, pleasant touch, and pressure. Pleasant touch is the social and emotional part of this sensory system. As mentioned earlier, they are distributed throughout the body, and they involve different type of receptors. As you could see down in the table below, there are different type of receptors which are involved in these different sensations. For most of these bodily tactile sensations that arise from the skin, muscles, and joints, the primary target in the brain is the parietal or the somatosensory cortex. In this illustration, there are the sensations that are received from the skin. That there are typically many receptors in the skin which are involved in these different bodily tactile sensations. For instance, there are vibration sensors, temperature sensors, or light touch sensors. However, the sensors or the bodily tactile sensations for proprioception, they arrive from different other sensations or receptors in the body, and they are placed in the joints or in the muscles. So in this manner, the proprioception is involved when movement is present, and is often referred as the kinesthetic sense, where movement is an important part. And this is all these sensations, they are transferred or sended towards the brain, and the target, as mentioned, is the somatosensory cortex. Only one of the sensory sensations does not have the target in the somatosensory cortex, and that is pleasant touch. Pleasant touch is processed in a different area in the brain, which is called the insular cortex. And the insular cortex represents the awareness of emotions and is involved in self-awareness. So these bodily tactile sensations are also importantly involved in our understanding of our awareness of ourselves, and more importantly, our bodily awareness. Furthermore, the information from the skin, tendons, muscles, and joints are carried up the spinal cord to the brain, the somatosensory cortex, so a person can feel the different bodily sensations. So the spinal cord and their systems in the spinal cord, which are referred as tracts, different tracts, are involved in transferring the information received from the bodily tactile senses up to the brain. So it's again important to mention that our bodily position or bodily positioning is involved in the sensations, especially since the spinal cord is involved. And finally, these bodily tactile sensations, as mentioned, reaches the somatosensory cortex or the tactile brain area. And this somatosensory cortex is organized to reflect how the elements in the body is laid out, or the organs are laid out. The body map, which is called, isn't scaled to reflect the how big or how large they are, but they reflect sensitivity. That means, like for instance, the hands and face are relatively small or physically, but they are highly sensitive, and they are given a bigger place in this somatosensory cortex. And this again reflects the, the amount of area allocated in the somatosensory cortex. It reflects sensitivity and not how large they are. So again, this is a very special way the bodily information is organized in the tactile brain, and often it is referred as the somatotropic organization. So this, again, just to give you all a brief understanding of the structure and function of the bodily tactile sensation. And this is important to understand the pragmatic understandings are important to when we want to think about strategies or interventions. So this is a basic understanding of how bodily tactile sensations are processed. However, these bodily tactile sensations are independent. As we know, they are sensations in them in their own. That means like temperature or pain or vibration. They are sensations on their own. They have their own receptors and they have their own system. And thus leads to what we call as the independent functions of bodily tactile sensations. And in this case, when regarding genetical or neurological conditions, there might be specific impairments in any of these bodily tactile sensations. So in this case, we could talk about the proprioceptive sense. So when this system, this particular bodily sensation is affected, we could see that there will be a decrease in the proprioceptive sense. So for instance, we could see it, in impairments of proprioception has been seen in patients with Parkinson's disease. And as we know that many individuals with charge syndrome would also have a poor proprioception, and often, as we know, an atypical body positioning, as we could see in individuals with charge. So again, it's reflecting the independent functions of the bodily tactile sensations. But this bodily tactile sensation could also be interrelated. In that manner, they could work together with the different bodily sensations. For instance, one of the interrelated functions of bodily tactile sensations is our ability to perceive wetness. Since there are no wet receptors in the somatosensory system, we learn to perceive wetness through the interaction between moisture and the bodily sensations of temperature, light touch, pressure, and pleasant touch. That is the subjective awareness of pleasantness. So I used to say that even my car is equipped with a wetness sensor on its windshield, but we don't have a wet receptor. And this makes an important point in that manner, that our bodily tactile sensations have the ability to combine different bodily tactile sensations, and it's a learning sense. Right? So often when I present this, there's no wet receptors in our body, many of us are in a way amused that we don't have it, but neurophysiologically, we don't have any wet receptors. So now, well, there's a quiz question I would like to put forward, and it's like, can you describe how water feels without saying wet? So you got to reflect over it and just imagine how we could describe the feeling of water without using the word wet. Let's look at a historical, in a retrospective way, in connection to the perception of bodily tactile sensation of wetness. As you know, the historical event which occurred between Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller, where, well, many of us or all of us know about. It's when water was spelled on one hand, while water was streamed on the other hand, right? And this is mentioned as one of the awakenings, the connection between the word and the tangible substance of splashing from the pump, right? So at that, just imagine the bodily tactile sensations involved, on the other hand, literally, would be the elements of temperature, light touch, pressure, pleasant touch. Well, I suppose Helen Keller must have the ability to learn to use this sensation and perceive wetness. So this is again something, I mean, I see it as fascinating to understand the perception of wetness. So this brings us back to the concept of perception. As we know, we go further from bodily tactile sensations to the next group, which is called the bodily tactile perception. Bodily tactile perception, it is the interpretation of tactile sensations. And to define bodily tactile sensation, it is the ability to use active touch and motion. And this could be described in two ways. One, which is called the tactile object identification. It's about to gather information about the surface properties of objects, such as smooth, rough, hardness, softness, to gather information about the physical dimensions of objects, weight, shape, size. It's about to identify similarities or differences among objects. And it's about to categorize or group objects, which is placed under the tactile object identification. While on the other hand, we have what is referred as the tactile object location. And this is to locate objects in the external environment or to locate places in the external environment, right? So these again elements of perception, bodily tactile perceptions, which again plays an important role in, in the tactile working memory. So here are some examples of how tactile object identification could look like how a person will use their hands, and especially when regarding deaf blindness, some will even use their feet and body to localize or to identify an object, right? So some things, some objects will be identified using their fingers and hands, while some will use their whole body in this identification process. And this is referred as the tactile object identification. Furthermore, when regarding tactile object location, this is referred as the bodily tactile spatial navigation. In this sense, people with deaf blindness rely primarily on bodily tactile information and self to object spatial coding. That means they use their own body towards the navigation to a place or object, uh, and update the position of the body in space while orientating themselves in the environment and tactually determining an accessible pathway. So here again, the tactile working memory plays an important role, even though in many sense we could refer this as mobility training. But again, in a cognitive manner, this is how tactile working memory is involved in this spatial navigation. So these are some examples of people with deaf blindness moving around the environment and locating a place or actually determining a pathway, again, where the working memories plays an important role. There are again neuroscientific evidence suggesting a dual neural pathway involved in the tactile object identification, which is referred as the what pathway, and the tactile object identification referred as the what path. It's where pathway is the first one. And the other one, it's called the tactile object location, and it's referred as the where pathway. And these similar systems have been defined also for the visual and auditory systems. And finally, we have the bodily tactile cognition. And this is the systematic organization and integration of tactile sensory perceptual information. As mentioned in the model, the information processing model, there are many cognitive processing units, but in this talk, I will focus on the tactile working memory unit or the tactile working memory process, which has been mentioned is a central and critical function in the system. So tactile working memory, it's the working memory in the bodily tactile modality. In other words, it's the ability to use active touch and motion to hold in mind bodily tactile information and use it in the moment. So it's again using the information in the moment. Working memory in general and tactile working memory specifically is described or categorized in two ways. One is referred as the cognitive working memory, and the other is referred as the social working memory. The cognitive working memory is one of the the concepts which are known to many of us, while the social working memory is a concept which has been promoted in the past recent years. So what is cognitive working memory in this sense? It's again keeping in mind and tracking task relevant information according to the needs of the moment. And this could be any kind of problem solving uh, uh, activities or tasks which we are involved in. And it's about maintaining attention, it's about remembering, or it's related to remembering, and it's about planning, organizing, and updating. So this is more related to the cognitive working memory, which is more or less well known in the literature and in clinical studies. But on the other hand, social working memory, that is keeping in mind what has occurred in the past and integrate this social information in order to achieve a cohesive understanding of the present. So again, here it's about not about task relevant information, but it's about social information. And here again, the working memory plays an important role. So elements of social working memory will include perceiving and recognizing the emotional states of others, and which is often it's the emotion perception element. It's about interpreting the behavior of others in terms of mental or emotional states, and these are often referred as the mentalization process or social cognitive processes. And finally, facilitating joint attention and turn taking, which is the social interaction aspects of it, are also related to the social working memory. Again, neuroscience have shown evidence that there are distinct brain regions supporting cognitive working memory and social working memory, although there are overlapping areas regarding these functions. So social working memory, that is the ability to keep cognitive and social information in mind, is strongly linked to communication or communication development and language processing. So in this manner, by promoting working memory strategies, and in this case, tactile working memory strategies, it is possible to promote communication and communication development, and also language and language processing elements. So this leads to the next topic is like how, how could we promote tactile working memory, and what kind of strategies we could in a way implement to promote tactile working memory. So the final topic for today will be on the tactile working memory scale. So I suppose this has been, now many of you are aware of this tactile working memory. I suppose you're not all ready from beginning to end, but there is many of the things which I've mentioned now are written in this manual. So this manual was developed to identify and assess tactile working memory in people with deaf blindness, and especially congenital deaf blindness, but also with people who need bodily tactile information processing in regards to communicative or cognitive development. So it's a scale in a way to highlight the importance of tactile working memory and to implement strategies which could promote tactile working memory. Right? So in the next section I will mention about the scale and the strategies relevant to the promotion of working memory in the bodily tactile modality. The principles of the assessment is based on three major aspects, and these principles are called the ecological, the transactional, and the dynamic elements of it. So it's these three elements are important to follow when we are assessing the bodily tactile working memory, uh, for instance, in people with congenital deafblindness. The ecological is about recognizing environments or settings in which the individual will function at an optimal level. The transactional, it's about focusing on the bidirectional and reciprocal exchanges between the person and the social partner over time. And it's again focusing on just not working memory as a static thing, but as a dynamic process, right? So the development of working memory should be seen by the interactions between the social partner and the person in concern. And finally, you have the dynamic aspect, which is which is in effect integrating intervention into the assessment and to support the individual to successfully perform. Right. So these three principles are important to follow when using the tactile working memory to assess working memory in the bodily tactile modality. The manual has the scale has 20 items within three theoretically derived domains that measure the cognitive and social cognitive processes of tactile working memory during tasks, activities, and social interactions. The three theoretically derived domains are encoding. This is the initial interpretation of the sensory information or the bodily tactile sensory information. It's about how information is maintained. And finally, it's about how information is being manipulated, often referred as actively controlling attention. So this is how the scale is built on with 20 items and three theoretically derived domains. But the theoretical foundations is based on the, as mentioned earlier, the information processing system, which includes both the cognitive elements of working memory, but also the social elements of working memory. Right? So here is some examples of how the items would look like, and there are a profile showing where the items would be placed, whether they are under the domain of encoding, maintaining, or manipulating. And here are examples of, like, for instance, item 3 will try to identify a person's ability to identify objects in the bodily tactile modality. While item 6, it's about how the person has the ability to identify objects or places or locations through the bodily tactile modality. And there are items which also capture the social working memory elements. So again, this profile or the items are based from the theory which I mentioned earlier. And when regarding the principles of assessment, as mentioned, one of that is about the dynamic principle of assessment, which is about integrating interventions into assessment. So in this case, one would use the tactile working memory before or as an assessment baseline. And there will be an intervention period. And then finally, it's a reassessment period where you use the tactile working memory scale again to see how the profile has changed over time. But the main important part of this assessment, it's not the scale before and after, it's about the interventions. It's about giving the right interventions to promote the tactile working memory items as that has been identified through the scale, right? So the importance of this scale is not the scale elements or the items, but it's about the intervention process, right? So again, this is what I would like to highlight in the last few minutes I have. And this is about how to mediate effective learning strategies. And these learning strategies will be based again from the theory model which have been described earlier regarding tactile perception, tactile cognitions, and tactile social cognitive strategies. So let's start by these strategies which could be implemented regarding or when promoting tactile working memory. So the first group of strategies are called the social cognitive strategies. And this is about optimizing the social environment within a bodily tactile modality. And this is many of these elements of social cognitive strategies must be known for many of you all who work regarding interaction with individuals with deaf blindness. However, these elements will include detecting and following the social attention of the person, but again in a bodily tactile manner, being reactive to the emotion and needs and moods of the person in the bodily tactile modality, stimulating reciprocity and turn-taking social interactions in a bodily tactile manner. So even though the social cognitive strategies would be in many modalities, but in this in connection of promoting tactile working memory, it's about using these strategies in the bodily tactile modality, right? And finally, it's about providing many opportunities for bodily tactile interactions. And here there are examples of how providing many opportunities for bodily tactile interactions could look like. It's about, in other way, about bodily attunement and body positioning, how in a way information, it's again the sense of touch or the bodily tactile sensation. It's a proximal sense, in the sense you need to be close as possible to intervene or implement these social cognitive strategies. So there's a whole lot of effort placed on the social interaction or the interaction partner. The second group of strategies, it's called the tactile perceptual strategies. And this is about adapting the learning environment within a bodily tactile modality. Again, providing opportunities for shared exploration. These are tactually examining objects together, supporting the person to systematically explore objects or localized objects or places. And then again, it's about providing time and opportunities for tactile exploration. Again, some examples of how the exploration could be look like, and here you could see one of It's an adult with congenital deafblind who, in a way, leans her head forwards towards a mixer to get the sensations of vibration. So one of the important bodily tactile sensations. So it's again how to provide time and opportunities for tactile exploration and the gathering of information through the bodily tactile sensation. And finally, we have the tactile cognitive strategies. And this is again, it's about promoting cognitive strategies that support tactile working memory. Many of these strategies have been explained and in the visual and auditory modality, uh, and it's well known, uh, but there are very few literature on these cognitive strategies in the tactile, bodily tactile modality. So again, the manual and the interventions procedure is based on how could we use the cognitive strategies known in the visual and auditory modalities and in a way modify them or in a way understand them in such a way that that it will promote tactile working memory. So these are some of the examples which I would go through. It's one is the association strategy. It's about supporting sequential touch and associate the information with things the person known or already is familiar with. It's a narrative memory strategy, which is the next one. It's about supporting the person to formulate a personal memory of an event in a narrative format. There's a chunking strategy. It's about providing a sequential strategy in which the bodily tactile information is arranged in a step-by-step procedure. There is a rehearsal strategy, and especially in the tactile modality, it's referred as the tactile spatial rehearsal strategy. It's about guiding the person to repeat the to be remembered bodily tactile information in a purposeful manner. And finally, it's about the metacognitive strategy, and it is engaging the person to think consciously about his or her learning and thinking processes. Right? So these are elements of the many of the cognitive strategies, but the major differences here is the difference is about how would it look like or how could we implement these strategies in the bodily tactile modality. So here are some examples of these strategies. For instance, when we talk about an association strategy, it's about how the person with deaf blindness who has a basic understanding of a tree within the bodily tactile modality would understand a bush. Well, a bush has aspects like a tree. So in the case, the person and the interaction partner must sequentially touch and tactually explore the leaves and branches of the bush. The bush is also like a wall. In this case, the child or the person with congenital deaf blindness and his interaction partner must track and trace the edge to find the opening of the opening of the bush such that the bush becomes a tree wall, right? So again, from the understanding of a tree in the bodily tactile modality, it is possible to introduce association strategy such that the person will also understand a bush, which in this sense will be a tree wall. Again, based on the bodily tactile elements such as sequentially touching and tactually exploring the leaves and branches, and not and most importantly, being with the person to track and trace, which will be different from association strategies in the visual and auditory modality. Similarly, we could talk about a narrative memory strategy. And here there are certain elements of it. For instance, helping formulate a personal memory of a shared event or activity in a narrative form, such as providing a coherent script or a thematic coherent script. For instance, a story of exploring a tree trunk in the bodily tactile modality. Here again, the story is using bodily tactile elements of exploring a tree trunk, as could be seen in the top photos, where the interaction partner and the person with deaf blindness are exploring a tree in a tactile bodily manner. And in the next stage, it's about engaging the person in a memory dialogue in the bodily tactile modality during or immediately after the event, right? And it's again to talk about, to converse about the event and create a memory dialogue. And finally, it's about providing opportunities for the person to share the personal narrative that provide material for further conversation about the shared past event. And this is referred as joint reminiscing. That is about reminiscing about a shared event. So these are elements of how a narrative memory strategy could be implemented in the body tactile modality. An example for sequential chunking and strategy and rehearsal strategy. For instance, there are two interaction partners involved in a bodily tactile activity with a person with deaf blindness, and the activity is about pushing the tree while the rainwater falls on all of them. The rainwater falls on the person with deaf blindness, making him wet, and he's thrilled, right? And remember, this is again a bodily tactile sensation, the perception of wetness. So while this activity is going on, it's to introduce a counting sequence that helps the person to keep track with the here and now information and to relate to what comes next. And this could be 1, 2, 3, push the tree. And here again, guiding the person to systematically repeat the bodily tactile counting sequence, which is the tactile spatial rehearsal strategy, right? And then scaffolding the person with deaf blindness to take initiative to start the counting sequence himself. So here again, it's a combination of several strategies, but briefly, it's about the sequential chunking. It's about introducing elements of chunky, huge information into small chunks. For instance, the 1, 2, 3, which many of us use 1, 2, 3. Or during my presentation, I think I've used the word first and second and third and finally. This is how, in a way, we manage a lot of information by chunking them. And this could be also done in the bodily tactile modality. And the final example, it's about a metacognitive conversation. It's about how the teacher or the interaction partner notices, describes, or discusses the person's mental processes while asking questions regarding his or her thinking processes, right? When, for example, here the interaction partner could be involved in a multi-tactile, multi-party conversation and giving the opportunity for the person to take a listening role and an overhearing role during a multi-party conversation. Right? And metacognitive conversations, they may facilitate equal participation and invite the learner into a dialogue about thinking about how they think and to be reflective about what they understand. Furthermore, and giving an opportunity to take a listening and overhearing role will also promote elements of the working memory, especially regarding the executive level of working memory, which is referred as the to be cognitive flexible, right? So giving the role of taking what shifting roles will have a huge impact to enhance the executive functions of the tactile processing system. And it will also stimulate, in a way, enhance social working memory aspects, such as social turn taking. Right? So in many of these examples, the same interaction or the interventions would lead to many processing processing elements regarding both cognitive and social. So in sum, the working memory in the bodily tactile modality is linked to various sensory perceptual and cognitive functions and can be flexibly used to support a variety of tasks performed in daily life and in social contexts. Supporting tactile working memory strategies for people with deafblindness may help promote communication and language development and reveal cognitive potentials and also improve social connections. So this is my last slide. So thank you for your attention.
Jude, we have a few questions from the chat if you are ready for those. So we will start with the first one, and someone asked, how does felt and observed touch relate to theory of mind?
A really interesting and a central question, because it's very related, to start that way. They are very much related regarding the observed touch and the theory of mind. And this is often regarding neuroscience. It's also placed under the mirror neuron systems, right? Hopefully many of you all know what the system is. But anyway, these are the same systems which are involved in when it comes to the observed touch, right? So again, the brain, as it is, as I mentioned, it's not just areas or just working on itself. It's an interrelated organ, right? So many of the functions which we see are also interrelated. So we could talk about observed touch. We could talk about the theory of mind. We could talk about the mirror system, and many of these are interrelated, right?
Thanks, Dr. Nicholas. Another question. Children who may be tactile sensitive might find it difficult to feel the object and to handle its characteristics. How do we support them?
Again, a really good question. I like to describe tactile sensations in two ways. We have what we call oversensitivity as a concept, and we have decreased tactile sensory processing, right? Just imagine, in another sense, we have hearing, problems with hearing or impairment, but we also have what we call as hyperacusis, right? Which is the oversensitive for sound. And there are many patients who have normal hearing, they have hyperacusis, right? So again, we have to decide or describe whether the same person has a reduced ability in their tactile processing system, or if it is a tactile sensitivity problem, right? So again, the person who has a tactile sensitivity or defensiveness will, of course, won't touch objects and will be, will be deprived in using their tactile system or bodily tactile system. But again, if that is the case, right, so we need to address tactile defensiveness not as a sensory reduction, but as a sensitivity. So the intervention should differ regarding. So if you have a sensory impairment, you should address it in a different way. But if it's a sensitivity problem, you need to address it in a different way. So where children with deaf blindness who have most probably a sensitivity problem, but not a reduction problem. Right? This is an assumption, right? But because they are not using their system, they will be deprived in this in the tactile system, bodily tactile system, right? So again, we should, in a way, most of the interventions based on tactile defensiveness, we should gradually understand the problem, right? And in a way, as we know with many of the good interventions we have for this defensiveness, it's about slowly and gradually introducing these children to objects, right, or to use their sense of touch, right? And so again, back to basic bodily sensations. It's again, is it light touch, which is a problem? Is it a proprioception? If it's a problem, we need to also make a good analysis of which of the bodily sensations are reduced.
Thank you. We have a couple questions related to the scale. So one of them is this scale specifically directed toward non-visual learners, or does it also have relevance with low vision deafblind individuals?
The answer, it's also relevant for low vision learners, right? It's again, it's not, as mentioned in my presentation, it's about using or focusing more on the bodily tactile system, or to improve the tactile working memory scale. The tactile working memory. So the scale could be used for people with low vision. Again, the focus is about improving the processing, information processing in the bodily tactile modality, right? And it's again very specific, right? So many people with low vision would have many interventions based on the most probably at the tactile perceptual level, right? They could be all from braille learning to tactile discrimination and navigations and mobility, but often it's a less weight will be given on the social cognitive strategies and on the cognitive strategies.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. This is also related to the scale. How long does it take to administer this full scale, including pre-intervention, intervention, and post-intervention? Or is this something that is constantly assessed?
It's constantly assessed, because it's again, as I've mentioned, it's about the intervention process, right? So it's again, on some of the interventions are easy to understand and maybe readily could be implemented. The others, like say some of the cognitive strategies, it takes some time to build up, right? So the intervention could take time, right? And it's also the environment, in this case, the person who is going to do the interventions should also be attuned in the bodily tactile modality, right? And many of us who are hearing and sighted individuals, uh, the bodily tactile system is not the natural system we use, right? So it's again some of the focus should be of how we could be more attuned in the bodily tactile modality and apply this again, because one of the things which you say regarding time, it's again introducing the bodily tactile strategies, but also the interaction partners or the teachers or the caregivers, they need a lot of supervision, coaching to use this in their in the environment they are in, right? So it's again the time limit is again not only on the person in this sense, but also in the environment.
Perfect, thank you. We have one more question for you. It's from Sandy, and she says, I work with a student who wets her fingers with saliva before and while exploring objects. Do you feel this might be related to tactile sensitivity? She is now wearing a mask at school and so is using her saliva less often. Is this perhaps an example of neuroplasticity?
It is like, I mean, that's the point. Thank you for, it's a good example, and it's true. Well, it's a good example of neuroplasticity, right? And it's again a simple definition of neuroplasticity. The more you use it, the better your brain becomes. It's as simple as that. And of course, it's again using your bodily tactile modality for. And the bodily tactile sensations in this case will lead to a change in the structure or function of the brain. So yes, that might be an example of neuroplasticity.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering those questions. We're going to pass it to Linda to wrap it up for us.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Jude Nicholas. Thank you. This was fascinating. And I have some takeaways. You know, we have lots of experience in training in vision and hearing losses and how to compensate and how to have good strategies. But this area of the bodily tactile memory gives us a whole new area to explore. And this is especially important because now we're seeing more children who are deafblind with extremely complex needs. And touch and the tactile aspects take on a much greater role in our approach with our strategies and best practices as teachers and interveners. I really liked a couple of your phrases, touch starved. You know, it's so true, all of us in the pandemic, but it's so critical for people who are deafblind at all times. And I loved your the working memory aspect of the brain sticky notes. That, you know, they're working things out in the moment, and that whole idea of giving them time to do that and recognizing that that's what's happening. I love the reference to Helen Keller, you know, our hero, and the water pump. And sidebar, Lynn and I have both actually seen the actual water pump.
Really?
It exists in Alabama, and we were so thrilled to actually see it. So every reference to Helen Keller is special to us. I thought the questions that came up today were great, and I really like the tactile sensitivity aspect, because that is something we're dealing with. And you gave so many examples too of the intervener, or you call it the communication partner, interaction partner, in creating these memories. I also really think the whole idea of neuroplasticity gives us great hope for different routes of access and how important the element of touch is. And also that you gave us research on children who have vision loss and hearing loss and how they have developed ways to compensate using the bodily tactile modalities. And for the people here, many of us on this call had the great pleasure of hearing Dr. Jude Nicholas last week in the Deafblind International Texas Symposium on Deafblindness. And the audience was quite taken with two areas. One, the insular cortex. People thought we should get some t-shirts made, awareness of emotion, self-awareness, and also the body map. You know, when we think about touch, you know, people who aren't in the deafblind world might just think more of hands. We have to think of the whole body. And if they move a toe, that's communication. And this really helps us see that bigger view of touch as well, and to feel more comfortable working in that area of touch. So thank you for that. And finally, you've taken what could be a very complicated topic and broken it down to an understanding for us. This is very much appreciated, and we look forward to more work in this area. So thank you again.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for your great comments. And it's like, if that's my whole intention too. It's a complicated sense, right? I mean, because remember, people still think it's a primitive sense, right? Compared to vision. And one of my main ambitions is to say, no, it is not. More importantly, maybe it's more complicated than visual and hearing. I'm not going to compare, but there are evidence suggesting that. So it's important. The concept of, you hear me say the word bodily, tactile many times, and I do it on purpose, right? Because immediately we use the word tactile, we think hands, right? So, but for me, you know, the scientific word for it's called somatosensory, and somo means body, right? So it's actually more of a bodily sense than a tactile sense, right? But it's important again to make people aware of it, because it's like, as you say, it's one of an important sense which we should not neglect or reject, and as you say, create optimism and hope based on the information we have. And that's one of the things which I would like, I hope to do in this presentation, and hopefully I did it. Yeah.
You did. Thank you again. And everyone is clapping, I'm sure, across the province.